Welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. I'm John, Father John Deere, and today I'm speaking with my friend Kathy Kelly. This podcast is a project of www.beatitudecenter.org, where you can find many other wonderful podcasts and regular Zoom programs on the nonviolence of Jesus and practicing nonviolence and working for a more just, more nonviolent world. So I like to always begin with a little prayer. So I invite everyone, wherever you are, to just take a deep breath and just relax and notice how you're feeling and center yourself again. And together, let's all enter into the presence of the God of peace, who loves you infinitely and personally and everyone. And let's welcome the risen nonviolent Jesus here with us. Just take a moment to ask for whatever grace you need to follow Jesus ever more faithfully and do God's will of peace. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life, love, and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect together on your call to be peacemakers, to follow the nonviolent Jesus, and work for a more nonviolent, more just world. Bless us, inspire us, disarm us, strengthen us, and send us out to do your will, that we might do our part to help end war and poverty, racism, greed, and all injustice and violence, nuclear weapons and fascism, environmental destruction, that we might be your holy beatitude people, that we might fulfill our vocations to be your holy peacemakers and welcome your reign of universal love, nonviolence, and peace on earth. In Jesus' name, amen. It's a great pleasure to welcome today my friend Kathy Kelly, longtime peace activist, author, and Nobel Peace Prize nominee. As we record this, Kathy is participating in and helping to coordinate a 40-day fast for an end to the U.S.-backed Israeli genocide in Gaza, which her fast began on May 28th. Kathy Kelly has traveled the world to the places bombed and attacked by our country, the United States, over the last 3 and 4 decades in an effort to make peace and love enemies, more than any other person I know. With Voices in the Wilderness Friends from 1996 to 2003, she traveled 27 times to Iraq, defying the economic sanctions. I asked Kathy to lead our 1999 Fellowship of Reconciliation delegation to Iraq with several Nobel Peace Prize winners, one of the greatest experiences of our lives. She was in Iraq throughout the 2003 shock and awe bombing and initial weeks of the U.S. invasion. She has joined subsequent delegations to the West Bank's Jenin camp in Palestine in 2002, during and after those Israeli attacks, was in Lebanon during the 2006 summer war between Israel and Hezbollah, and to Gaza in 2009 during Operation Cast Lead, and following the 2013 Operation Pillar of Defense. She made over 24 trips to Afghanistan from 2010 to 2019, living with young Afghan peace volunteers in a working-class neighborhood in Kabul. Kathy Kelly is board president of World Beyond War, and in the last few years co-coordinated the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. Since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, she has co-coordinated an international network to assist young Afghans forced to flee their country. It's a great pleasure and a blessing for me to welcome my friend Kathy Kelly. Kathy, thank you for joining me on this podcast.
Well, thank you, John. I'm so glad that your podcasts are reaching many people and that your commitment to being a practitioner of nonviolence, following the nonviolent Jesus, still reaches me. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, we're going to dive right into it. So let's start. Everybody take a deep breath. We're going to start with the horrific U.S.-funded Israeli genocide in Gaza, which has killed, at least 56,000 people in Gaza since the horrific Hamas attack on October 7th, 2023 that killed 1,195 Israelis. So, Kathy, you and our friends have been fasting since May 28th, I think, and intend to
Actually,
fast
May 22nd.
May 22nd, since May 22nd, and you hope to go through 40 days. But there are some 750 people around the country and the world doing shorter fasts in solidarity with you and others. But about a dozen of you are keeping vigil outside the United Nations and marching in New York. It was organized by our friends at Veterans for Peace, along with Friends of Sabeel. So let me start by asking you in your own words to tell us why you're fasting and about the fast for peace.
Well, John, a lot of times when you engage in a fast, people turn for you. And then you have the chance to say, oh, but what about? And I think that what about question is so important right now concerning Gaza because, I wake up every morning and there's electricity and clean water to drink. And I haven't worried about snipers killing children that I might be caring for overnight. I haven't had to worry about walking through rubble or all of the contaminants of bomb residue. In short, when we try to limit ourselves to something similar to the caloric intake of people in Gaza right now, we don't have even a tiny fraction of the other horrific and I think deliberate attacks, especially being waged against children. So we must call attention to it. The destabilizing effort to relocate people and force them out of their land has continued worsening every single day since we began this fast. And you can see on the faces of people that are staffers working at the United Nations, they know. And there's I think a great sense of conscience burdening them because there are things people at the United Nations could do. And it doesn't mean that those wouldn't be very difficult things to do, but we think of the risks that people like Dennis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck took when they were employed by the UN in very prestigious jobs, both of them as Undersecretary Generals of the UN with regard to Iraq. And when they saw children starving in Iraq again and again, when they recognized that, in Iraq, the pediatrics wards were like death rows for infants, they resigned their posts one after another. So, what could the UN do now? There is a resolution called Uniting for Peace. And it's a very, very important resolution because when it's invoked, then even if there has been a veto of a ceasefire issued within the Security Council, the nations of the General Assembly could bypass that veto, more or less overrule it. And that's what we're really hoping for. The countries of Ireland and Pakistan and Spain and Slovenia, immediately after the last US veto of a Security Council resolution, filed for a debate. And in such a debate, it's possible that the countries could say, there is one country that is preventing the achievement of peace. And, in our case, it would be the United States partnering with Israel in its war right now, a war Unicef calls a war against children. So there's, I suppose, a level of suspense, but there's also civil society arising all around the world to protect people in Gaza. And that's very impressive.
Kathy, by the time this airs at the end of June, I'm thinking the fast may be done. And unfortunately, I'm hoping it would be over, but I doubt it. So I just want to ask you there about any thoughts or suggestions to our thousands of listeners about what folks can do. And I would think that would begin with educating ourselves about Gaza and the genocide and talking about it, educating others. But maybe you have some more specific things.
Well, I certainly agree with you, John, about education being so crucial. As we ask elected officials or United Nations representatives to take more of a risk, then of course we have to consult with ourselves. is there a greater risk that I might be willing to take? And what I've noticed is that in every city around the country, very strong grassroots efforts are happening. In New York, people just today demonstrated in front of the Maersk company, that's Maersk, and said, stop loading ships with weapons that are taken to Israel. And I think people can go in front of the corporations in this country that manufacture these hideous weapons. We found that people were being lured to get food at hubs of food distribution that had been set up by the United States and Israel through this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And when they got there, they were being shot at by the Israeli Navy, by Israeli drones, and by tank fired missiles. Many of those weapons have been manufactured here in the United States. And so, if anyone listening lives anywhere near a Raytheon or a Boeing or Lockheed Martin or General Atomics factory, it's crucial to go to those places, hold up signs, talk to the workers, and ask people to stop that kind of production. And of course, to go to the elected representatives and tell them that you will have a long remembrance of how they are voting during this time of genocide, and that any elected representatives who favor killing children, holding children accountable for what is happening in Israel and Palestine and the occupied Palestinian territories, that those people ought not to be governing this country.
Kathy, as you know, one of the great voices that we're hearing from Palestine is Reverend Munther Isaac of Bethlehem, who gave the sermon Christ in the Rubble that went viral around the world. And he now has a book out called Christ in the Rubble, and I'm getting him to be on this podcast. He's been calling all Christians in the U.S. to speak out against the U.S. funding for Israeli genocide. So I wanted to ask you about that. In particular, what would your message be to the churches, to Christians, like Munther, about, hey, folks, how can we be following the nonviolent Jesus and be silent on what's happening over there? And while I'm at it, just for the record, your thoughts on where the nonviolent Jesus and the God of peace are in all of this.
Well, I think about how Pope Francis truly was a symbol of unity for Christians and others all throughout the world. And I see Pope Leo entering in that direction as well. But for instance, here in New York, we've gone to every Sunday, gone to St. Patrick's Cathedral, and you don't hear the hierarchs in New York speaking out. So it's really dependent on people in the pews to say, look, we do follow the nonviolent Jesus, and we will speak out, even if the people appointed to lead us are themselves perhaps not so able to do that for whatever reasons of compromised conscience they might have. So I think the line that it's important to remember is that the means you use determines the end you get. And if you use means of silence or indifference or changing the subject, then that's what you'll get in the end, indifference and silence. But if we use means that are kindly, compassionate, but very determined, then I think we can reach an end similar to what happened with South Africa. Eventually, the nations of the world were able to say to the South African apartheid government, you can no longer participate in the family of nations. And then Nelson Mandela was released from prison. So we're hoping that that sort of playbook would be reenacted, that the countries of the world will, out of frustration, but also out of conscience, say to the United States and Israel, if Israel keeps flouting international law, the countries of the world can't afford to see the edifice of international law chipped away at because a few countries refuse to abide by it. Israel has thermonuclear weapons. That in itself is in violation of international law because they've never declared themselves to be a nuclear power. And Israel's violations of international law happen every time they attack civilians who've already been forcibly displaced. And so we've got, the International Criminal Court stating that Israel's leaders are in uh, violation and ought to be brought before a court. But the United States has said, well, then let's sanction the jurists in the International Criminal Court. We've got the United Nations saying we know how to distribute this food. And the United States says, well, let's sanction the United Nations Food Distribution Group. It's called UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Association. So I think in order to give teeth to the resolutions which have been made and to denunciations which are continually being made, Israel and the United States must be held accountable. Can people in the pews of the churches accomplish that? I believe that with constant education, with parishioners saying, okay, we're going to have a Palestine focus group. We're going to read Pastor Munther Isaac's Christ in the Rubble. There is a tremendous accomplishment that is available to Catholics throughout the United States.
That's great. Thank you, Kathy. I want to step back and ask you some more general questions about this whole life of peacemaking you've had, about solidarity, loving the enemy, and grief. And I want to begin with, I think I told you this. I never forgot when you and I and our friends went to Baghdad in 1999, and you had organized the whole trip. And that first night, the welcome dinner with some of the great leaders. I think it was the great woman from CARE who was later assassinated during the 2003 war. It was one of the great saints. And she began her welcome by saying, if you come to stand in solidarity with us here in Iraq, you will suffer because we are suffering. And I thought that was amazing, even though it's so obvious. Your whole life, as I look at you, Kathy, has been one long attempt at living in solidarity with the peoples being killed and threatened by our country. And that is extended to the people of Central America, Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, Yemen, and many other places. So I wanted, because it's such at the heart of, I think, being human, nonviolence, peacemaking, the gospel, this kind of living solidarity beyond borders. I wondered if you could reflect with us about that for a moment.
Well, I remember Margaret Hassan
Yes,
trying she was from Ireland and she married an Iraqi man. And
wow.
She tried so hard to get water to people, big, huge bladders of water. And the idea that she would be kidnapped and tortured and killed was so astonishing to me. And yet her life was a well-lived life, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I think about Dorothea Soella.
Yeah.
And she was a theologian who said, yes, raise the lament. She thought it was so important never to skip that stage of raising the lament, but then follow it up by organizing. And, I think about Phil Berrigan, who used to say, don't get tired, don't give up. And so how do we best raise the lament? And it really changes all the time. I remember as a teenager seeing the photo of a young Vietnamese girl, and she was running down the street naked, agonized because napalm had been sprayed on her and her brother, and these little children were literally running away from the U.S. troops. And I think that little girl's photo, that iconic photo, helped to end a war. But lately, so many of us have seen on our screens on our phones the pictures of Gazan children silhouetted in flames. I think of a little girl named Varda Al-Khalil, and she and her family were in a school courtyard So they're forced into a courtyard living in tents, and the tents were bombed, an aerial bombardment by the Israeli Defense Forces. And this child lost her mother and five of her siblings. Her father was terribly injured, and she survived. But ought not her picture at least start a resolution toward a ceasefire in our time? So I guess, when we hear Dorothea Suella say, raise the lament, we must do that, but we must also keep trying to figure out how can we best organize to make a difference.
That's so helpful, the great theologian Dorothea Soleil. So, following up on that, it's a similar kind of question I want to ask you about Jesus' teaching and commandment in the Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies. And you can tie that in with your global solidarity, but so the flip side is back home organizing and speaking out here in the U.S. And Kathy, I don't know if we ever talked about this, but no one ever told me that I had to become an organizer. But it's like a requirement today for every peace activist, not just marching, you have to become an organizer. So, but to frame it this way, Kathy, if you can hang in here with me, I think at the heart of the nonviolent Jesus' greatest campaign speech, the Sermon on the Mount, is that commandment, love your enemies. And that everybody gets it wrong because we all think, oh, that means that person across the street I don't like. It's nation-state language. It's your nation. It's the people targeted by your nation for death. Jesus says, you go and love and stand with those people. And that's what you have tried to do as you've embodied the Sermon on the Mount. So I want to ask you to reflect, because we don't hear enough about this central teaching of Jesus, to love the enemies of the United States. And there's a lot of them, unfortunately, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Central America, but now Palestine for all these years and the children of Gaza. So we're talking about here a global, universal, nonviolent love. Anything you want to share with us about that?
Well, John, isn't it interesting that the people who would have first heard Jesus' teachings really believed that the end of the world was coming? And I mean, they were wrong. Here we are. But now we stand in the face of three enormous threats to human survival: nuclear annihilation, the possibility of more pandemics, and, of course, ecological catastrophe. And so, in a way, that should make it easier, I think, for us to consider love of enemy on the nation state level. Because don't we have more in common with the people in China or in Russia or in North Korea or in Iran? Now that we all have these common problems we face, don't we need their scientists as much as we need our own to all get all hands on deck and find ways to get through ecological catastrophe? Afghanistan has been declared this week likely to be completely without water by 2030. We find that any of the funds and scientific know-how being directed into artificial intelligence to control nuclear weaponry, it puts us all in peril. So I think love of our friends, our brothers and sisters in China, in Russia, in North Korea makes so much sense right now. And if we have any commitment to the children in our own country, in our own lives, to the grandchildren, then we really have no choice but to try and find a way for a common homeland to be entrusted to those children in the future.
Wow, thank you, Kathy. You remind me of what Dr. King said. He was talking about Jesus and himself, he was being challenged as you're just an impractical. This kind of universal love is impractical idealism. And he said, no, it's the only practical realism we have left. On a similar,
I was so pleased, John, to see teenagers in Jordan when I was last there make stickers for themselves saying that they wanted to be compassionately maladjusted because they'd really read Dr. King's words about how he
That's
never intended to become adjusted to
Isn't that amazing?
white supremacy or to apartheid or to enemies being scorned.
It's amazing. To the listeners, I always joke Kathy's our general, and she called me once. I was in a parking lot in Wyoming about to give a speech, and she says, "John, I need you to go to Afghanistan." To which I said, "When am I leaving?" And, I got on a plane and left that week along with Shane Claiborne and our friend, the Nobel laureate Mairead McGuire. And I get there, and Kathy's lined up these friends, the Afghan youth in Kabul. And Kathy, they were memorizing Martin Luther King's speeches in Arabic.
Yeah.
I've never recovered. It was so beautiful. And they were desperate to hear us talk about Dr. King and nonviolence. But now I want to go back again to this question, which is very deep, and you've already brought it up, about lament. And I want you to say a word intentionally about it. So it's lament and grief and love, but then don't forget, you're saying, therefore, organize. And so this was when Kathy and I were in Baghdad. And, to get there, you have to bring your water. You drive in trucks 24 hours through the desert to Baghdad. And we've been there, and now we're coming back. We've met thousands of people. And it's that long drive through the desert. And I was sitting next to you. You don't even remember. And I said, "So, Kathy, you've been going like every 2 months you go to Iraq." And she then went on to Afghanistan and Gaza and Yemen. I said, "Okay, but how do you do this? How do you keep entering into the world of suffering and global solidarity with the people our country has killed as a way of life, like Thich Nhat Hanh did and who taught us?" To which you said, "I've learned to take quiet time each week to grieve for all the people I've known who have died and all the people dying from our wars and our greed." And that grief, you said, in effect, had become a spiritual practice for me. I never heard anyone say that. And now it's the normal for me, and I've been teaching it. I think it's required, as you say, because of what we're doing to the environment and with the nuclear threat. So I just wanted to ask you, because I don't know that I ever have, to say a word about grief as an intentional part or aspect of our life as peacemakers.
I don't know that we can really find words for expression of grief commensurate to the crimes being committed. But that's okay. Silence, I think, in the face of the enormity of the crimes, knowing that we really will never have the words in any language commensurate to these crimes, is, I believe, a form of prayer. And so if people are reduced to silence and to their tears, let those tears flow. You or I would be a rock if we didn't feel that deep, deep emotion of grief and lament. But it does require some time. And, our days become very, very busy. It's easy to feel connected all over the world. But, if you need to take a season out, a whole season, that's okay. But I think probably for most of us, at least some time during the day or during the week, when we recognize just how hard we've made life for others because of the comfort that we've grown accustomed to, without being overwhelmed by guilt. But I do believe, one of the graces of being part of a fast like this is to be able to sit in silence for a stretch and then get up and leaflet people or certainly welcome people. But I've been very grateful for the silence here in busy New York with all the construction, to hold a sign that says, "We cannot say we did not know," or another sign that says, "There's no flag great enough," as Howard Zinn put it, to cover the shame of killing innocent people. And then to implore other people who are more powerful to make a difference as they can and where they can.
Thank you, Kathy. You've demonstrated throughout your whole life the power of someone to just say, well, I'm going to do something. I can't do everything, but I can do something. We all have the power to do some public action and to organize. You're always got something going on, Kathy Kelly. And at the moment, you're the chair of World Beyond War, and I want to ask you to tell everybody about that project and anything else you want to about other projects. And I put it to you before that I always think of, the title of that group is amazing because half of our work, to paraphrase Arundhati Roy, is helping people reclaim the imagination, which is, she says, one of the first casualties of the culture of war. People can't even imagine a world without war. You can't imagine a world without the occupation of Palestinians or nuclear weapons or racism or fossil fuels and poverty. And you and I have to help people reimagine it and work toward this new vision. So tell us a little bit about that.
So World Beyond War has said we're against all wars. We're not going to cherry pick and say, this war is okay, but that one wasn't so good. And I think when Russia invaded Ukraine, actually, many people in the peace movement said, well, we do have to approve war against Russia because of the terrible violation of international law and of norms. But World Beyond War said, no, we aren't going to get behind any resort to war, always calling for diplomacy, believing that Albert Camus was right when he said he'd make the terrible gamble that words are stronger than munitions. So do we really believe that? Uh, I'm pleased to work with World Beyond War because it's trying to create chapters all around the world that really do believe that. And, the United States government doesn't like to see international organizing that tries to basically get people everywhere in the world on the same page, saying that the merchants of death, those who make the weapons and sell the weapons, are actually in violation of any kind of international law.
And yet that's precisely the vision of the nonviolent Jesus and all the peacemakers in history, that war doesn't work. And to be human is to welcome a new world of peace where everyone has food, housing, healthcare, shelter, jobs, dignity, education, and that all of this is doable. And yet we get so bought up in this country that, I got, as you say, I have to support the country in any war, it says, or this war really is necessary. But how can people help people learn that war is obsolete, it doesn't work, and it's now threatens the entire planet? And so you and I have kind of dedicated our lives to just keep teaching peace. Any final thoughts about encouraging others to go forward and teach peace even in the face of war?
Well, when Jesus was in the temple and he went to the money changers who were supporting oppression of ordinary Palestinians and particularly poor Palestinians, he turned over that table. And I think that we could turn over the tables if we became more linked together. And that's not so easy always, but we can find the kindred spirits and say, all right, let's together say we're not going to allow that table to be upright, and find nonviolent ways to turn it over. And that means that we find who we can link up with. And I believe that Pax Christi International has been great at doing that. Fellowship of Reconciliation International, World Beyond War in its effort to be international, but to keep on looking for those kindred spirits and build those relationships, believing that ours is to plant the seeds, and it may be for another generation to reap the harvest. But if people are thinking, well, where do I find my kindred spirits? I would say go to the place in your neighborhood where people are rolling up their sleeves, cutting up vegetables, making soup, getting ready to serve the neediest or make room for shelters for those who have no place to stay. Find that group, and from there, you'll get linked up to the others who are dealing with the world changing environmental problems.
Well, thank you so much, Kathy Kelly, for speaking with me today. And thank you, friends, for listening to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. You can hear more podcasts and find other upcoming Zoom programs at www.beatitudecenter.org. And please consider offering a donation to support this free work. And if you can, please leave some positive feedback or review at the National Catholic Reporter or Apple or Spotify or whatever platform you use, and help spread the word by telling friends about this podcast. And may the God of peace bless us all. Keep on following the Nonviolent Jesus, and see you next time.